The North Atlantic in 1944 was a place of contradictions, where icy, silent horizons concealed some of the most decisive and violent struggles of the Second World War. Convoys steamed endlessly between North America and Britain, their cargoes feeding not just armies but entire nations. But on certain mornings, far from the chaos of war, the ocean could seem deceptively calm. It was on a dawn like this, on April 17, 1944, that a Royal Navy patrol first reported something they could not immediately explain. A German Type 7 U-boat drifting motionless, its bow rising cleanly from the water, its conning tower exposed, and its hatches open as if expecting visitors who never came. There was no damage, no smoke, no signs of a fight. Just a submarine silently waiting, crewless in hostile waters. In those years, Allied crews knew the North Atlantic as a graveyard of nerves. Sailors from HMS Leamington, a British destroyer assigned to the formidable convoy escort group B4, had seen what a dying submarine looked like: oil slicks, splintered decking, torn pressure hulls. But this vessel was different. As the destroyer approached, no counterfire erupted from the deck gun. No crash dive disturbed the sea. Instead, the boat drifted with an almost eerie serenity. For the men on watch, cold, exhausted, and accustomed to danger, the stillness was unnerving. There were no distress flares, no radio signals, no movement. The challenge for the Leamington's officers was immediate. Any encounter with an enemy submarine demanded caution. Even an apparently abandoned U-boat could conceal booby traps, scuttling charges, or a hidden sniper. Boarding actions were rare and risky, especially in waters where wolf packs sometimes coordinated deceptive tactics. Yet the duty to investigate fell clearly upon them. Lieutenant Commander Dennis Rees, serving as acting captain, ordered a slow approach. Engines quieted. Depth charge launchers were secured. Riflemen gathered at the bow, scanning the conning tower for the slightest flicker of human presence. Historical records from the Admiralty later noted that the boarding party consisted of 7 men, 2 petty officers, 3 seamen, and 2 engine room artificers, each selected for steadiness under pressure and for familiarity with German U-boat layouts. One of the petty officers carried a small black notebook used during training, containing hand-drawn schematics of Type 7 interiors. "Treat every hatch like it's alive," the margin note read, words repeated often in briefings for close-quarters engagements. The team launched in a small boat, their oars cutting silently through the frigid surface. When they reached the submarine's hull, the quiet was overwhelming. Diesel exhaust odors lingered faintly, suggesting the engines had been running not long before. The metal was cold, but not as cold as it should have been after hours adrift. Something had happened recently. But what? As they climbed the ladder to the conning tower, the men expected at least some sign of life. A boot left behind, a helmet, a bloodstain. Instead, the surfaces were spotless. A fresh coat of grey-blue paint, Kriegsmarine standard, was unmarred except for salt spray. The open hatch leading below seemed to invite them inside. A wartime intelligence report from the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command later preserved a quote from one of the boarding petty officers. "It felt wrong, sir," he recalled. "A U-boat isn't quiet. It breathes. It hums. But this one, it was like walking into a room someone had just stepped out of, only you couldn't tell where they'd gone." Inside, the air carried the metallic tang of machinery and damp wool. Gauges on the control panels read normal pressures. Periscope lenses were clean. One of the engine room artificers noted that the diesels showed signs of recent operation. Heat still radiated faintly from the block. Even the electric motors seemed undamaged. But the crew, they were simply gone. Bunks were unmade, blankets folded back as if men had just risen for duty. A tin mug of ersatz coffee sat half-finished near the navigation table. Most disturbing of all was the radio station. A message sheet lay half-typed, the line abruptly ending mid-word. The timestamp on the log indicated activity well after midnight, hours after the last recorded Allied anti-submarine sweep. Yet there had been no SOS, no emergency broadcast, no scuttling attempt. The boarding team found no signs of water intrusion, no gas leaks, No damaged bulkheads. Weapons were secured. Torpedoes remained in their tubes. The bilges were dry. Everything pointed to normal operations, right up to the moment the crew vanished. Modern historians often caution against drawing conclusions from incomplete evidence. But even in 1944, experienced officers understood the implications. Whatever had happened aboard this U-boat had unfolded fast. Too fast for a crew trained to react to crises with drilled precision. Men who had survived the brutal Atlantic campaign, who lived and died by discipline, did not simply abandon a submarine in working order. By late morning, HMS Leamington radioed the Admiralty with a stark assessment. Enemy submarine found adrift. No crew aboard. Cause unknown. It was the beginning of a mystery that would confound both Allied and post-war German records for decades. And as the Leamington's men prepared for a deeper search of the vessel, a nagging question began to form among them. One no one dared voice aloud yet. If the crew didn't abandon the submarine, then where had they gone? The decision to board an enemy submarine in wartime was never taken lightly. Even a dead U-boat, one floating quietly, seemingly abandoned, carried risks that could turn fatal in seconds. But for the men of HMS Leamington, the events of April 17, 1944, presented a situation so unusual that it demanded immediate investigation. Once the initial sweep of the control room and forward compartments revealed no hidden threats, Lieutenant Commander Dennis Rees authorized a full internal search. What the boarding team found would only deepen the mystery and raise questions Allied intelligence could not easily answer. The first challenge was understanding what the submarine's condition actually meant. A combat-damaged U-boat carried a signature: ruptured pipes, burned wiring, warped bulkheads from depth-charge blasts. But this Type 7 showed none of it. The machinery spaces were intact, the valves uncorroded, and the electrical panels in working order. For Sub-Lieutenant Francis Hale, one of the engineers who came aboard, the condition was both reassuring and troubling. If a boat surfaces like this, he later wrote in his post-action report, it is because someone commanded it. Engines do not simply quit and bring a submarine up cleanly on their own. Moving aft, the team found more perplexing details. In the galley, pots still sat on the stove, though the burners had long gone cold. A loaf of dark rye bread, standard Kriegsmarine issue, had been sliced but left untouched. Personal effects lay where they had been dropped: a cap embroidered with the emblem of the 7th U Flotilla, an open Bible with a bookmark thread placed at Psalm 91, a pocket diary containing a neat column of coordinates for the previous week's patrol. Nothing suggested disorder or panic. There were no overturned stools, no scattered papers, no signs of a struggle. Human absence, though, had a weight of its own. The deeper the men pushed through the submarine, the more unsettling that absence became. As one petty officer described it, you felt like they should be there. You expected to turn a corner and find a machinist wiping down a wrench or a watch officer checking gauges. Everything was ready for them to return. Only they didn't. In the radio room, the unfinished message drew the greatest interest. German procedures required meticulous logging of radio traffic, even during combat. The half-typed line, "Angrupp stand," cut off abruptly, as though the operator had been interrupted mid-transmission. Radio intelligence officers aboard Leamington speculated that the message may have been intended for BDU headquarters, though its incomplete state offered no clarity. One detail stood out: the Enigma machine remained uncovered. Normally, crews protected it during surfacing or emergencies. Its position suggested the operator had been preparing to encode or decode a message. Yet the cipher wheels were not aligned to a standard daily key setting. This inconsistency was noted but not understood at the time. The boarding party proceeded to the aft torpedo room. Here they found 4 sailors' hammocks still hanging, a cramped, claustrophobic reminder of U-boat living conditions. A harmonica hung from a nail in the bulkhead, a small personal luxury in an otherwise utilitarian space. But again, there was no one. No log entry explained a mass evacuation. No signs indicated crew had attempted repairs. Every man was simply gone. Intelligence officer Lieutenant Rees made careful note of environmental factors as well. The air was breathable. CO2 scrubbers were functional. Ballast tanks showed no signs of rapid flooding. All of this undermined theories circulating among the Leamington crew. Gas leak was the first whispered explanation, yet there were no indicators of chlorine infiltration, battery acid fumes, or exhaust buildup. A catastrophic system failure might cause a panic, but not orderliness. By late afternoon, the boarding team provided the Admiralty with an initial assessment. The submarine was abandoned for unknown reasons, likely within the previous 12 hours. The engine's residual warmth supported this timing. Sub-Lieutenant Hale added a detail that would later fuel debate. He believed the diesel engines had been shut down manually. This was not a drift. Someone secured the machinery. If the crew had escaped into the sea, there would have been clues, oil-soaked rafts, flotation gear, or bodies carried by the current. None were located, despite a 2-hour sweep by Leamington and an accompanying corvette. The frigid temperatures around Iceland made survival in open water nearly impossible beyond minutes. Yet no remains were found. Allied analysts considered other possibilities. A mutiny. While rare, disciplinary breakdowns had occurred on isolated U-boats under extreme stress. But mutinies left scars, forceful entries, damage to equipment, or attempts at sabotage. Yet this vessel carried none. Defection was another theory, especially as German morale declined in 1944. But where could a crew defect to in the middle of the North Atlantic? And why leave a fully functioning submarine behind? With every question added, the mystery only deepened. In the final hours of daylight, HMS Leamington began towing the U-boat toward Reykjavik for a more thorough technical examination. The boarding team secured the hatches and rigged lines. As the destroyer pulled the drifting submarine westward, one of the petty officers reportedly said, "Feels like we're towing a ghost." He meant it metaphorically, of course. There was nothing supernatural here, only the stark reality of war and the unexplained absence of dozens of trained sailors. But as the North Atlantic winds picked up and twilight settled over the waves, one truth became clear. The questions raised aboard that empty submarine would not be answered easily, either by the men of Leamington or by the Allied command waiting on shore. The following morning, as the Leamington continued towing the mysterious U-boat toward Reykjavik, Royal Navy officers convened to assess the unprecedented situation. Naval protocol dictated that abandoned enemy vessels be treated cautiously, but nothing in wartime records prepared anyone for a craft entirely intact, engines functional, and yet devoid of crew. Every aspect of the vessel, from its diesel engines to the meticulously organized quarters, suggested normal operations had been abruptly interrupted, with no external force involved. The question that lingered above the bridge was both simple and unsettling. How could a trained crew vanish without a trace? HMS Leamington's captain, Lieutenant Commander Dennis Rees, ordered an extensive inspection of the engine and mechanical systems. Sub-Lieutenant Francis Hale led the artificers through the engine room, examining the twin Germania-Werft F-46 diesel engines that powered the U-boat's surface transits. Heat radiated faintly from the cylinders, confirming recent operation. Fuel valves were open, lubricants properly applied, and the electrical switchboards indicated a normal overnight cycle. If the submarine had been forced to surface, or abandoned in a hurry, the engineers saw no evidence to suggest why. Even the periscopes, normally retracted after a dive, were partially extended, as if awaiting a signal or reconnaissance. The control room offered equally perplexing clues. Charts detailing patrol routes lay neatly stacked, a mechanical pencil resting on a trajectory line leading toward the Iceland-Faroe corridor. Depth gauges read 0, ballast tanks appeared empty, and the compass showed no unusual deviation. Officers carefully recorded every detail, understanding that post-war historians would scrutinize these observations. Yet despite their meticulous notes, no explanation emerged. There were no signs of flooding, collisions, or mine damage. Every mechanical system and piece of navigational equipment functioned as intended. Further complicating matters were the personal effects of the crew. The boarding team found sailors' diaries, neatly written, describing routine patrol duties, drills, and minor repairs. In one entry, a machinist noted, "Routine watch uneventful, morale high, expecting storm tomorrow." The tone was mundane, almost banal. Another diary contained a curious observation: "Strange stillness today. The sea seemed to listen." While the latter was poetic, intelligence officers noted it without judgment, focusing instead on the operational record. There was no evidence of panic or illness. There was no warning of impending disaster. Allied analysts at the Western Approaches Command began forming hypotheses. Could it have been a catastrophic gas leak? Battery acid poisoning? Sudden CO2 buildup? Every potential environmental hazard was evaluated. Measurements of oxygen levels and chemical traces conducted later on deck suggested that air quality had been normal, with no detectable concentrations of toxic gases. The bilges were dry, and ventilation fans showed no evidence of obstruction. Nothing supported the theory of crew incapacitation from environmental factors. Another theory involved psychological strain or mutiny. U-boat service was notoriously grueling, with extended patrols under oppressive conditions. Some mutinies had occurred in earlier years, especially in harsh Arctic waters. However, mutiny typically left a signature: sabotaged engines, overturned furniture, or incomplete destruction of classified material. The U-boat in question bore none of these marks. Weapons were secured, torpedo tubes loaded, and classified communication equipment, such as the Enigma machine, remained operational and uncovered. The possibility of an operational mishap was equally problematic. A sudden need to surface due to an unseen problem, perhaps a minor hull breach or mechanical failure, might explain abandonment. Yet every gauge, valve, and pressure reading suggested that the submarine had been mechanically sound. Even the hydroplanes and rudder responded properly during towing tests conducted by the destroyer. There was no technical failure to force a rapid exit. Amidst the mechanical and procedural investigation, the boarding party turned to documentation. Ship logs indicated routine patrol schedules. Personnel rosters confirmed that a full complement of approximately 45 men had departed Bergen on April 5, 1944, under the command of a captain lieutenant with extensive North Atlantic experience. Submarine patrol reports intercepted via ultra-decrypts matched departure times, but no subsequent communication indicated a disaster or emergency. The official German records showed no evidence of the U-boat's loss, nor did they note any missing crew, a discrepancy that would continue to puzzle Allied intelligence for years. Despite the absence of any definitive cause, Lieutenant Commander Rees emphasized caution. Orders were sent to maintain a tight cordon around the submarine as it was towed into port. "Treat it as a live vessel," he instructed. "The crew may have abandoned ship, but do not assume it was without reason." The men on board remained acutely aware of the unknown. One wrong move could activate hidden scuttling charges or trigger other latent dangers. The tension was palpable, not born of combat but of sheer uncertainty. By nightfall, the Leamington had only partially closed the distance to Reykjavik. As the Arctic winds whipped across the deck, the officers contemplated what they had seen: a vessel in perfect condition, crew missing, and no explanation that satisfied the evidence. Historians later noted that this was a scenario rarely documented in the Atlantic campaign, a true anomaly that defied conventional wisdom about submarine warfare. And as the ship sailed on, every man understood one unspoken reality: the mystery was far from solved, and the next phase of investigation promised questions that might never be answered. The haunting absence of the U-boat crew loomed over every decision, a silent reminder that even amidst meticulously charted waters and calculated naval operations, war could still produce enigmas that left both sailors and strategists grasping for answers. As HMS Leamington continued its cautious tow of the unmanned U-boat toward Reykjavik, Allied intelligence officers began to piece together what little documentation existed about the vessel. Using intercepted German communications and ultra-decrypts, analysts sought to identify the submarine's operational history. The Type 7 was believed to be part of the 7th U Flotilla, a unit operating from Bergen, Norway, tasked with interdicting North Atlantic convoys. Records indicated the submarine had departed Bergen on April 5, 1944, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Vogel, a veteran officer with extensive North Atlantic experience. The mission itself seemed routine: Yet the absence of the crew presented an operational puzzle that no one could reconcile with the known facts of submarine warfare. The challenge lay in the lack of any corroborating German report. U-boat losses were meticulously tracked by the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot, BDU, and every sunk vessel was usually accompanied by either survivor accounts or detailed notes about the circumstances. Yet, in the archives recovered post-war, there was no mention of this particular boat's disappearance. There were no reports of an engagement with Allied forces, no accounts of mine detonation, and no internal notes suggesting mutiny or crew failure. For Royal Navy officers, this gap in intelligence amplified the mystery. A fully operational U-boat should have left some trace in German records, yet none existed. Boarding reports from the Leamington added further anomalies. The ship's log showed normal operation patterns, no signs of mechanical stress, no sudden dives or emergency maneuvers, and no damage that could force abandonment. Control room instruments were consistent with routine surface operations. Even the galley equipment and sleeping quarters suggested a crew had merely stepped out and vanished, a notion that strained credibility. One petty officer later reflected, "It was as though the men had walked into the sea and simply dissolved into it, leaving the submarine in perfect working order." Analysts then turned to potential operational hypotheses. Some speculated that the crew might have abandoned the vessel to escape unseen danger, such as an onboard fire or undetected flooding. However, mechanical inspections revealed dry bilges, fully functioning pumps, and no evidence of emergency repairs. Others suggested psychological breakdown or mutiny, particularly given the increasingly harsh conditions of the Atlantic theater. Historical records confirmed that long patrols in cramped, frigid U-boats did sometimes result in mutinous behavior, but these events were typically violent and conspicuous. This U-boat showed no signs of internal struggle. Communication logs offered an equally baffling perspective. Radio logs indicated that the last transmission had occurred late on April 16, 1944, but the message was incomplete, a half-cent code that ended abruptly mid-sentence. Intelligence officers could not determine if this indicated technical failure, human error, or interference. Given the encrypted nature of communications, even post-war review provided only fragmented insight. There was no evidence the message had been successfully sent or received, leaving a critical gap in understanding the sequence of events leading to the crew's disappearance. Historical context deepened the intrigue. April 1944 was a period of heightened Allied anti-submarine activity in the North Atlantic. Wolfpack tactics, previously employed with deadly efficiency by German U-boats, were increasingly disrupted by air reconnaissance, radar-equipped escorts, and coordinated convoy defenses. Any U-boat operating in this corridor faced immense pressure and the constant threat of detection. Yet, the lack of battle damage or distress signals on this vessel was inconsistent with typical operational hazards. It was, in essence, a perfect submarine caught in the wrong, or perhaps right place at the wrong time. Allied command began documenting the anomaly for further study. Reports emphasized that while U-boat losses were often tragic, they were usually explicable through enemy action, accidents, or operational failures. This instance, however, defied explanation. Sub-Lieutenant Hale's engineering notes, combined with the boarding officer's observations, painted a picture of disciplined operations abruptly interrupted without observable cause. It was as if the submarine had been abandoned under circumstances invisible to both Allies and Germans, a haunting absence that left more questions than answers. By late afternoon, as the Arctic sun dipped toward the horizon, HMS Leamington neared Reykjavik. Naval officers debated possible next steps: further inspection, tow to port for technical analysis, or eventual scuttling to prevent the submarine from falling into unauthorized hands. Regardless of the decision, the empty U-boat would now enter the annals of naval intelligence as an unsolved anomaly. Its crew's fate remained entirely unknown, a gaping hole in both Allied and German records. As officers prepared to transfer the vessel into port control, one thing was certain: the mystery of the missing crew had not just survived the Atlantic crossing, it had deepened, challenging assumptions about human behavior, operational discipline, and the unpredictable nature of war. And in the cold Icelandic twilight, as the waves lapped silently against the U-boat's hull, The unanswered question lingered over every deck officer and boarding crew member. If the crew didn't meet a conventional fate at sea, then where, and why, had they disappeared? By the time HMS Leamington delivered the enigmatic U-boat to Reykjavik, the situation had transformed from a peculiar naval curiosity into a matter of intense intelligence interest. Both British and American officers recognized the potential strategic value of understanding what had happened, and the implications extended beyond a single missing crew. If the disappearance were a consequence of operational failure, mutiny, or secret experimentation, lessons could be drawn to improve Allied anti-submarine strategy, or to anticipate further German anomalies. Yet as naval analysts prepared to dissect the vessel, the more they examined it, the less sense it made. Upon arrival, the U-boat was secured under armed guard at the port, where officers from the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Command, the Admiralty Technical Branch, and representatives from the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence began formal investigations. HMS Leamington's boarding officers provided testimony, detailed logs, and photographs, documenting every compartment, instrument, and personal effect. The vessel itself was intact, each system operational, yet the absence of the crew remained an irrefutable fact. No log entries, no distress signals, and no environmental anomalies offered a plausible explanation. Even a meticulous inspection of the ballast tanks, periscope mechanisms, and torpedo launchers revealed nothing abnormal. The intelligence teams explored several possibilities, each more speculative than the last. Some suggested that the crew had abandoned ship due to fear of catastrophic mechanical failure, perhaps a sudden risk of flooding or engine explosion. Yet the engineering notes from Sub-Lieutenant Hale confirmed that all machinery had been correctly maintained and fully operational. Every gauge indicated normal pressures, every valve was in proper position, and diesel engines showed signs of controlled shutdown, not emergency cessation. There was no evidence of the kind of imminent danger that would compel a trained crew to evacuate mid-ocean. Another theory involved mutiny or attempted defection. The psychological stress of extended patrols, particularly under the increasing strain of Allied air and naval dominance, had occasionally led to insubordination. Mutinies aboard U-boats were historically rare but not unheard of, usually leaving traces of violence or sabotage. However, in this case, every personal effect was in place. Weapons were secured, and critical intelligence equipment, including the Enigma machine, remained operational and undisturbed. If the crew had mutinied or attempted to defect, it was executed with a level of precision and coordination that defied precedent. Allied cryptographic and signal intelligence officers considered the incomplete radio message recovered by the boarding party. The line terminated mid-word, and while some suggested it might indicate a sudden interruption, technical failure, operator error, or even interception, it offered no conclusive evidence. Even post-war review of ultra-decrypts failed to reveal additional context. The U-boat had effectively disappeared from the operational record. Its departure from Bergen was noted, but its fate, and the fate of its crew, was absent from German reports. Debate extended to theories of operational secrecy or clandestine missions. The North Atlantic was a theater for experimental tactics, intelligence-gathering operations, and even early reconnaissance for potential post-war research projects. Could the crew have been extracted by some unknown mechanism or reassigned under covert directives? No supporting evidence was found. There were no rescue logs, Allied or German, and no indication that external forces had removed the crew from the submarine. As days passed, the investigative teams faced the stark realization that conventional explanations were insufficient. Technical inspections could account for nothing more than the vessel's remarkable intactness. Environmental hazards were ruled out. Mutiny, defection, or accident offered no coherent narrative. Every hypothesis left unresolved gaps, and the men assigned to document the U-boat found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. This was a naval enigma. Despite the dead-end nature of the investigation, the U-boat's analysis yielded some useful operational insights. Officers confirmed the efficiency of Type 7 design, particularly in crew ergonomics and machinery layout. Documentation of the vessel's internal condition allowed Allied engineers to understand maintenance cycles, habitability, and the functioning of critical systems like hydroplanes, diesel engines, and torpedo tubes. These technical lessons, while valuable, did little to solve the central question haunting the intelligence community: the fate of the crew. The human element of the mystery was perhaps the most compelling. The crew had disappeared with no warning, leaving behind an environment as orderly as if nothing had happened. The boarding officers recalled the silent bunks, the half-drunk coffee, the neatly stacked charts, all everyday traces of life abruptly interrupted. For those who had faced the brutal realities of submarine warfare, the absence was more disorienting than any physical threat. It was a reminder that even in meticulously documented theaters of war, events could occur beyond understanding. As the investigative phase wound down, Allied command made a difficult decision. The U-boat, while of some intelligence value, did not justify permanent maintenance or risk of accidental capture. Plans were drawn for controlled scuttling once records and photographs were completed. Before that final act, the vessel would be studied thoroughly, but the central mystery, the missing crew, would remain unresolved. And so, even as the empty U-boat sat moored in Reykjavik harbor, wrapped in secrecy and guarded by armed sailors, a profound question lingered over every officer involved. In a war governed by orders, discipline, and chain of command, how could an entire, fully trained crew simply vanish overnight? The answer remained as elusive as the North Atlantic fog, leaving a lasting imprint on Allied naval history and the broader record of the Battle of the Atlantic. In the weeks following the arrival of the abandoned U-boat in Reykjavik, the mystery deepened rather than dissipated. Naval historians and intelligence officers alike revisited every piece of evidence: mechanical inspections, crew diaries, radio logs, and boarding reports. Yet each new review seemed only to reinforce the impossibility of what had occurred. A fully operational Type 7 submarine, completely intact and seaworthy, had lost its entire complement of 45 men without leaving a trace. No bodies, no lifeboats, no distress signals. By every measure, the disappearance was unprecedented in North Atlantic naval warfare. Post-war, British and American historians sought to reconcile Allied observations with German records. The U-boat had been assigned to the 7th U Flotilla, operating out of Bergen, Norway, and commanded by Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Vogel, a disciplined officer with years of Atlantic experience. German archives confirmed the departure from Bergen in early April 1944, but the records contained no mention of loss, engagement, or crew evacuation. No survivors were recorded, no letters sent home, and no administrative acknowledgement of the incident existed. For researchers, the absence of a paper trail was as haunting as the empty bunks themselves. Analytical theories ranged widely, but none could be confirmed. Some speculated a sudden mutiny or orchestrated defection, possibly planned over months, executed with silent precision in open water. Others proposed highly improbable operational anomalies, a sudden, undetectable environmental hazard that incapacitated the entire crew without damaging the vessel. Each theory clashed with key evidence. The engines were shut down methodically, the vessel showed no signs of struggle or damage, and all classified materials remained untouched. Even today, these contradictions challenge naval historians' understanding of wartime protocol and human behavior under extreme stress. The U-boat itself was eventually scuttled in controlled conditions after exhaustive study. Allied engineers documented every compartment, piece of machinery, and personal item before the final descent to the ocean floor. The ship's final log, photographically preserved, displayed the last recorded coordinates, machinery status, and environmental readings. Yet the absence of crew remained the central anomaly. In essence, the vessel became both an intelligence resource and a symbol of unresolved wartime mystery. Its physical legacy endured, while the human story remained suspended in conjecture. Cultural and operational reflections emerged from the incident. Historians noted that such unexplained events highlighted the limits of wartime intelligence, the unpredictability of human factors, and the immense pressures of North Atlantic operations. U-boat patrols were perilous, filled with monotony punctuated by sudden violence. Yet the sudden disappearance of an entire trained crew, under conditions of operational normalcy, represented a phenomenon that defied logic. The episode underscored that even in an era of meticulous planning, cryptography, and technological superiority, war retained elements of unpredictability that could never be fully anticipated. The empty U-boat story left a lasting imprint on naval lore and historical discourse. It served as a case study in both procedural rigor and human mystery. The necessity of detailed inspections, methodical intelligence gathering, and cautious operational planning, alongside the recognition that some events resist conventional explanation. In training sessions for naval officers, the incident was sometimes cited as a reminder of uncertainty at sea, emphasizing vigilance even when circumstances appear routine. Yet it also carried a more haunting lesson. History occasionally preserves anomalies that remain unresolved, leaving the human imagination to wrestle with the unknown. Today, the U-boat rests on the seabed off Iceland, its steel hull a silent memorial to the 45 men who disappeared overnight. No memorial plaque, no official explanation, no survivor testimony. Only the vessel and the record of meticulous Allied investigation. The incident continues to intrigue scholars and military enthusiasts alike, raising questions about discipline, human psychology, and the unpredictable nature of wartime operations. Ultimately, the story of this abandoned U-boat is emblematic of the larger chaos and complexity of the Battle of the Atlantic. It demonstrates that even with superior intelligence, extensive documentation, and decades of post-war research, some wartime mysteries endure. The unanswered questions about the crew's fate, their sudden disappearance, and the intact vessel they left behind ensure that this event remains lodged at the edges of naval history, a true anomaly in a meticulously recorded war. And so, as the North Atlantic waves continue their relentless march across the Icelandic shelf, one fact remains. The crew was never found, the reasons for their disappearance remain speculative, and the empty submarine remains a testament to the enduring mysteries that emerge from the fog of war. Even decades later, the question lingers in the minds of historians, sailors, and enthusiasts alike. How does an entire crew vanish overnight, leaving behind a vessel in perfect order? No answer has yet satisfied the evidence, and perhaps it never will.